Wonderful. I'm Novian Witsit, professor of English and Identity Studies, and welcome to our annual celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and the guest lecturer, who this evening is Madiba Dennie, a legal scholar, professor, and journalist, amongst many things. And I will be turning it over to our very impressive Chloe Rozga, who, from what I understand, has been accepted to a number of law schools across the country. And but she will be, yes, indeed, indeed. She will be introducing Madiba in a second. Before I turn it over to her, though, I just want to take a quick opportunity to thank our sponsors, for whom there are many. First is the Paideia program and the director, Kathy Reed. Then the Center for Ethics in Public Life and its director, Andy Hageman. And the Identity Studies Department. And maybe I should say, for those who aren't familiar with identity studies, it is a relatively new major at Luther, largely rooted in the social sciences and humanities. And it's interdisciplinary in nature as well. And it looks at the intersectional lived experiences of people and the ways in which they encounter, confront, and challenge systems of power. So if that sounds like something that you may be interested in, students, please sign up for some of those classes. And our last sponsor is the Williams Endowment, which is named in honor and recognition of Lawrence and Queen Williams for their dedication and years of service to Luther College. The endowment assures the continuation of our annual celebration of Martin Luther King Jr. lecture. Lawrence Williams came to Luther in 1985 and served 25 years. And he planned and solicited the funding for this particular lecture 20 times during his time at Luther. He retired in 2010, and he passed away in his hometown of Louisville, Kentucky in 2016. And his dedication to the lecture series reflected a commitment to understanding the civil rights that went beyond academic study. Professor Williams' personal experiences with the civil rights movement and its protest allowed him to share firsthand experiences with the campus and students, and his acquaintance with various civil rights leaders allowed him to bring a number of extraordinary people to campus to share their lives and experiences. So whenever we get to honor Dr. King, we also get to honor Lawrence, and we all miss him very dearly. So with that, I will turn it over to Chloe. And you can have it.
Before I introduce our incredible speaker tonight, I wanted to go ahead and read Luther's land acknowledgement statement. The land on which Luther College stands has been home to the Iowa, Sac, Fox, and Dakota people and their ancestors. As part of the neutral ground created by the U.S. government to control the movement, lives, and livelihood of Native peoples, this land was home to the Winnebago Ho-Chunk during their forced displacement from Wisconsin. The dispossession of the Iowa, Sac, Fox, and Dakota and the forced migration of the Winnebago Ho-Chunk people was motivated by the interest of settlers such as those who founded this town and this college. The Winnebago, during their residence here, addressed the land as grandmother. The tribe's orator, Wakan Dakora, believed his people were extended the blessing of this place by the Great Spirit, saying, "We did not make it, nor could we make it, so pretty and fair a land." Please honor this history and the ongoing connection of the descendants of these early residents to this place. Please also honor and care for the land, water, and resources as these residents did, like a loved and loving elder to whom we owe our life. And now to introduce our speaker. Madiba K. Dennie is an attorney, columnist, and professor whose work focuses on fostering an equitable, multiracial democracy. She is the deputy editor and senior contributor at Balls and Strikes and the author of The Originalism Trap: How Extremists Stole the Constitution and How We, the People, Can Take It Back. She's a fierce advocate for the rights of women, people of color, and all of us. Her legal and political commentary has been featured in The Atlantic, The Nation, Washington Post, and more. Dennie has been interviewed on air about race, gender, and the law on outlets such as the BBC and MSNBC. She has taught at Western Washington University and NYU School of Law. She earned her law degree from Columbia Law School and her undergraduate degree from Princeton University, where she concentrated in politics and earned a certificate in African American Studies. In her previous role as counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice, she provided legal and policy analysis regarding a range of democracy issues, including the census, the courts, and attempts to disempower communities of color. Her work reminds us that the law and the Constitution are meant for all of us, and that collectively, we can take it back. Please join me in welcoming Madiba Dennie.
Good evening, everyone. Oh, I love when folks say it back. Thank you, Chloe, for that kind introduction. And thank you, everyone at Luther College, for allowing me to kick off a week of events honoring the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. It is astonishing to me that King was only 39 years old when he was shot and killed in Memphis in 1968. In his brief time with us, King galvanized a movement for Black people's civil rights, challenged oppression in all of its manifestations, and articulated a vision for the nation's future with irrepressible moral clarity. King's goal was objectively a big one. Freedom for Black people in America would require restructuring the whole society. But in some respects, one could argue the demand was quite modest. King was only asking the government to keep its word. When King advocated for the liberation of America's downtrodden, the Black, the poor, and all those whose necks had been acquainted with boots, he frequently invoked the promises of egalitarianism expressed in the supreme law of the United States. In his most famous speech, delivered at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, King referenced what he called the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. King characterized the founding documents as a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. The Constitution promises Americans equal protection, due process of law, and a government by and for the people where the right to vote shall not be denied on account of race. King and over 200,000 others gathered at the Lincoln Memorial to push the country to fulfill that promise. The first aspiration King listed in his familiar "I have a dream" refrain was that this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. He continued, quoting the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The chasm between America's words and America's deeds is often vast. But failure to achieve a goal does not mean the goal itself has no value. And King recognized that it would be a mistake to conclude that the words are meaningless. The better takeaway is that we, the people, confer meaning onto the Constitution through our interpretation and application. I'll take a moment to explain what I mean by that, because I'm not trying to imply that any part of the Constitution can or should mean anything. Some of the Constitution's provisions are quite specific. Section 1 of Article 2, for instance, requires that the president be at least 35 years old. No matter how you look at it, 35 plainly doesn't mean 19. With all due apologies to any teenagers in the room tonight who were starting to contemplate a presidential run. But let's try a different provision. Section 2 of the 14th Amendment says no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Does that plainly tell you what the process is, or how much process is due? Does it clearly say if no amount of process is sufficient for some deprivations of liberty? Or directly tell you if the government can do anything to you as long as it checks the right procedural boxes first? I'm guessing that your answers to those questions are going to be no, 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 and no. Precious few parts of the Constitution are written so explicitly that there's only one reasonable meaning. Many provisions are generalities about which people are free to argue, and the arguments that win over time are what we understand as constitutional law. A given interpretation essentially becomes correct when enough people are convinced to accept it as such. When activists like King protested and engaged in other direct actions, when they did community organizing, went to court, and when they fought for the passage of civil rights laws, they inherently asserted alternatives to the legal status quo, and in so doing, they created and promoted new constitutional meanings. Now, what I just said is considered blasphemy in some influential circles. The Supreme Court is currently dominated by adherents of originalism, which claims that the Constitution has a single, objective, discoverable meaning. The central tenet of the originalist ideology is that the meaning of the Constitution is fixed in time, frozen at the moment of its enactment, and its provisions must be understood now as they were purportedly understood back then. There are a host of problems with this idea. Now, I'd like to quickly touch on two of them. First, if we're prescribing how law should work, originalism is morally indefensible. Maybe if you're a Protestant property-owning white man, you can get by okay on the legal standards of 200 years ago, but much of the country was much worse off. Yet originalists would have us shackle our constitutional interpretation to a time when people were literally in shackles. The predictable and often desired consequence of relying on makeshift historical standards is the endangerment of historically marginalized people. And second, if we're describing how law does work, originalism is simply inaccurate. Contrary to originalism's one true meaning, frozen in time idea, the Constitution's meaning has evolved, and most relevant to our conversation tonight, public agitation has discernibly influenced what gets recognized as legitimate legal thought. In fact, many aspects of American law and society that we now regard as unremarkable, like the absence of government-mandated racial segregation in public spaces, for one, were shaped in significant part by King's tireless advocacy. With that said, the Reverend Doctor's work is not done. Far from it. Worse yet, some of his work is even being undone by the conservative legal movement. King was instrumental in securing the passage of the Voting Rights Act, for instance, a landmark federal civil rights law that's supposed to make sure people of color can actually vote and that their votes count as much as white people's. The act was very effective for a while, dramatically expanding political participation and fending off discriminatory attacks on voting rights. But over the last 15 years or so, the Supreme Court has struck down key provisions of the act and made it harder to use the provisions it left intact. The court's right-wing majority has often justified these decisions in part by saying times have changed. Racism isn't an issue anymore, so the Voting Rights Act has aged out of constitutionality. No other laws appear to have constitutional expiration dates. But when it comes to laws crafted to remedy injustice, the court discards them like old milk. Concurrent with the court's abandonment of minority voters, Republican legislators have been passing a slew of laws to restrict people's ability to participate in free and fair elections and successfully disenfranchising people of color. King also famously fought for desegregation and for Black people to have access to education. The country gradually made headway on this goal too, Segregated schools were declared unconstitutional in Brown v. Board of Education, and affirmative action policies helped provide Black students the educational opportunities that they had been wrongly denied. But 2 years ago, in a pair of cases together known as Students for Fair Admissions, the Supreme Court ruled that race-conscious college admissions programs are unconstitutional. According to Chief Justice John Roberts, affirmative action violates the Equal Protection Clause because eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. This is a modern reboot of Roberts's infamous rationale for halting school integration busing efforts 20 years ago. In that case, he said, "The way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race." This tautological babble obscures something that I want to make clear. Roberts didn't mean discriminating as in oppressing. In his second usage of the word, he meant discriminating as in making distinctions. For the Roberts Court, the harm of racism comes from acknowledging racial classifications, and so attempting to mitigate injuries inflicted on racial lines is just as unacceptable as the actual injury. The insidious erasure of the distinction between inflicting racist harm and remedying racist harm has consequences that extend far beyond colleges and universities. By holding that race-conscious admissions programs violate the 14th Amendment's command to not deny the equal protection of laws to any person, the court made it constitutionally suspect for any institution that receives government funds to use targeted measures to advance racial equality and remedy harms faced by marginalized groups more broadly. Neutral policies, however, that is, those that leave social equality in place and do not unsettle the white supremacist status quo, those get comfortably brought into the Constitution's warm embrace. Right-wing reactionaries quickly and correctly recognized the court's affirmative action ruling was a gift to their cause. There are now a host of lawsuits challenging diversity and equity initiatives in other fields, and treating the mere presence of women, people of color, and queer people as legal grounds for suspicion. They call it anti-DEI. I call it segregation, of the same kind that Martin Luther King fought against. Perversely, conservatives have latched on to the idea that historic anti-discrimination legislation, like the 14th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act, require abstinence from the pursuit of justice, or worse, targeting the victims of discrimination, or else they would be discriminatory too. Recently, when a court found that Alabama had engaged in racial gerrymandering, drawing electoral districts in a way to artificially dilute Black residents' voting power, Alabama argued that any remedy would also be unlawful racial discrimination because it would be taking race into account. Judges have entertained the argument that it's illegal for the Minority Business Development Agency to focus on the development of minority businesses. Republican-led states have even argued, and some judges have been receptive to the idea, that it is illegal for the Environmental Protection Agency to try to stop chemical plants from persistently and disproportionately pumping dangerous pollutants into Black neighborhoods. The states argued that the Supreme Court's affirmative action decisions rejected this sort of racial engineering, as they called it. They know fully well that's not what those laws are supposed to mean. And if for some reason they don't, they should. But this willful misreading renders the Constitution powerless to actually redress harm and capable only of reinforcing it. King tried to make it easier to vote. Today it's becoming harder. He tried to integrate our society. Today it's being resegregated. He tried to use the law and change the law where needed to release the country from the chokehold of racism. Today, laws are being used and changed to reinvigorate white supremacy, among other forms of oppression, and rob the government and regular people alike of the ability to do anything about it. We've been here before, in a way. Legal victories have long been followed by fevered efforts to claw them back. King experienced great frustration with this in his day as well, since there was fierce fallout to the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, and school desegregation moved at a glacial pace. King observed in distress that white backlash had become an emotional electoral issue. He continued, and do tell me if this sounds familiar, men long regarded as political clowns had become governors or only narrowly missed election, their magic achieved with a witch's brew of bigotry, prejudice, half-truths, and whole lies. There is a very painful irony about Martin Luther King Day falling on the same day as Donald Trump's second inauguration as President of the United States. The first time around, his administration trafficked in racism, legal subjugation, and flagrant, often violent criminality, dangerous behavior that the administration plans to escalate and carry out with greater efficiency in its next term, now that it's had a little practice. Trump packed the courts with dozens of judges who refused to indicate whether they believe Brown v. Board of Education, the bedrock of modern equal protection jurisprudence, and quite possibly, I would contend, the Supreme Court's finest moment, was rightly decided. He then tried to retain the presidency by force and fraud, baselessly insisting the results in 2020 were illegitimate, harassing government officials to find fake votes for him, and instigating the deadly January 6th insurrection in an attempt to overturn the election results. Trump's lies about the 2020 election necessarily privileged the slim majority of white voters who voted for him as valid and denigrated the huge majority of voters of color who did not as fraudulent. The direction of his false accusations were not subtle. They were consistently lobbed at cities like Detroit, Atlanta, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, places that are majority Black or have large Black populations. By targeting Black communities as supposed hotbeds of fraud and illegitimate votes, Trump was branding Black people illegitimate members of the community, not entitled to self-governance. Trump's effort to nullify the votes of millions of people of color actively imperiled multiracial democracy itself. One might assume there would be consequences for doing such things. And in theory, you would be correct. The Constitution contains a specific provision enacted after the Civil War that bars people who held office and then tried to overthrow the government from holding office again in the future. But when Colorado followed the Constitution and kept Trump off the ballot, the Supreme Court intervened to block his removal, claiming to do so in the name of democracy. This paved the way for insurrectionists to return to the White House this morning. At the inauguration, Trump pledged to uphold the Constitution, an oath we know he has already violated. It has been suggested that this morning's transfer of power and the absence of violence that the nation experienced in 2020 shows that democracy's guardrails are still in place and functioning, but I don't entirely agree. It is not a sign of a healthy democracy that one side refrains from violence if and only if it wins. And I would argue that accepting the outcomes of elections is a necessary but not sufficient condition for a democratic society. A real democracy is about more than just the formal recognition that majority rules. It's about substance. As King said during the I Have a Dream speech, we can never be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. The federal government has constructed a world where it is democratic to permit someone to return to office after trying to overturn a democratic election, chiefly through violence and canceling out the votes of people of color, and undemocratic to enforce the post-Civil War amendments designed to facilitate and protect Black political participation. The world the Constitution constructs is quite different. Martin Luther King once wrote, as he assessed the condition of the country, "The American people are infected with racism. That is the peril. Paradoxically, they are also infected with democratic ideals. That is the hope. My hope, my belief is that the Constitution has a role to play in the development of a real democracy that works for all of us. The foundation of this belief is the Reconstruction Amendments. The term Reconstruction Amendments refers to the constitutional amendments ratified in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War in order to reimagine and redefine citizenship and civil rights for Black people. The 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery, with one regrettable exception, which permits slavery as punishment for a crime. The 14th Amendment is expansive, with provisions that include but are not limited to establishing birthright citizenship, extending political power to formerly enslaved people, and curtailing the political power of the insurrectionists who sought to defend slavery, prohibiting states from denying any person equal protection of the laws, prohibiting states from denying any person liberty without due process of law, and authorizing Congress to legislatively enforce these provisions. The 15th Amendment established a nationwide prohibition on race-based denial or abridgment of the right to vote, and again, gave Congress the power to legislatively enforce this command. The Constitution, as originally drafted, was contradictory, championing freedom with one hand and holding the enslaver's whip with the other. The post-Civil War amendments took significant steps to repairing this deficiency and spurring the country to make good on those aforementioned promises about equality and liberty and justice for all. Too often, the Reconstruction Amendments are treated as a mere addendum to the real Constitution that does not disturb existing hierarchies, individual rights, or government responsibilities. This is a grave misinterpretation. The Reconstruction Amendments embody a constitutional renunciation of the government-mandated political, economic, and social inferiority that had existed for the entire history of the United States up until that moment. They fundamentally transformed the Constitution in order to transform the country. This is an invaluable foundation, and one that I propose we build upon. To do so, I advocate for a new legal interpretive framework, which I call inclusive constitutionalism. At its core, inclusive constitutionalism refers to the idea that the Constitution must be interpreted in furtherance of an inclusive democracy. As I mentioned towards the beginning of this lecture, much of the Constitution has room for interpretation. I contend that we can and should think about the aims of that interpretation, and we should aim for a more equitable society. Crucially, these aren't the ill-founded wishes of a bleeding heart liberal. This is grounded squarely in law. The Reconstruction Amendments injected the nation's charter with a powerful liberatory directive. The purpose of the Constitution, as amended, is to facilitate the functioning of an inclusive democracy, by which I mean a society that extends full membership to all of its residents and enables them to participate equally in the nation's social, political, and economic life. The inclusive constitutionalism framework recognizes the work of Reconstruction as both unfinished and urgent. As King said when he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, we must never allow ourselves to become satisfied with unattained goals. We must always maintain a kind of divine discontent. Inclusive constitutionalism argues that Reconstruction's goals of ending oppression and bolstering full democratic participation should be the reference point for interpreting any part of the Constitution. When the judiciary is called upon to resolve a legal ambiguity, or when there are broad principles at issue that must be applied specifically, interpreters should consider how different legal analyses would move the country closer to or farther from an egalitarian world. Now, it would be an error to infer from my mention of the judiciary that the only legal interpretation that matters comes from judges. Courts do not have the only word, or even the last word. People do. Martin Luther King is again instructive here. The Supreme Court didn't just wake up one day and say, geez, it just hit me, segregation might be a bad thing. The text of the Constitution didn't change either in between the 1890s, when the court said a state could make sitting in a train car while Black a crime, and the 1950s, when the court recognized that segregation is unconstitutional. But the way people said the text must be understood did change. Social movements have the power to change constitutional meaning. I want to tell you a story about one such movement. This story starts in Montgomery, Alabama, on December 1st, 1955. Rosa Parks had been arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus for a white passenger, as was required in Alabama. Mrs. Parks asked the police officer, "Why do you push us around?" The officer replied, "I don't know, but the law is the law and you're under arrest." A local Black women's civic organization called the Women's Political Council then made leaflets urging Black people to not ride the bus on December 5th, the first day of Rosa Parks' trial, which they distributed in Black neighborhoods. And the overwhelming majority of Black people in Montgomery did exactly that. Local leaders realized they could keep this going. Quickly, they banded together in an organization they called the Montgomery Improvement Association, and they held their first mass meeting that night at Holt Street Baptist Church. One of the speakers at this meeting was a young reverend, just 26, who had moved to the area about a year prior. Reverend King spoke about the righteousness of their cause and told the audience, "We are not wrong, because if we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong." I should note here that Brown v. Board was decided the year before all this occurred. And people didn't really know yet whether the ruling would be cabined and applied only to segregation in public elementary schools, or if it would apply to segregation more broadly. By telling the audience, if we're wrong, they're wrong too, I think King was trying to assert that the protesters, the court, and the Constitution were already in agreement. To be against the Black Montgomery bus riders, then, is to betray the court and the Constitution. I would also submit, as an alternative explanation, that if they are in conflict, the court and the Constitution are wrong and must be changed. The one-day show of solidarity, first organized by the Women's Political Council, turned into what we now know as the Montgomery bus boycott. Tens of thousands of Black Montgomeryans maintained the boycott for 382 days. In November 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that the segregated bus system was unconstitutional. The state and city tried to appeal, were denied, and the desegregation order became official on December 20th, 1956. The boycott ended the next morning, at which point Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and other leaders boarded a bus and sat near the front in what was formerly a whites-only section. I won't claim the boycott was the only factor in the Supreme Court's decision, nor will I claim there was a sea change in the treatment of Montgomery's Black residents overnight. But I will say, I don't think the court's decision can be fully explained without accounting for that protest. The Montgomery bus boycott was a community expression of principle backed by power. Regular people collectively declared that segregated buses were unacceptable, and they put severe economic pressure on the government by boycotting those buses and depriving the city of fares. Montgomery's Black residents were also the majority of the bus system's clientele in the first place. By the time the Supreme Court formally changed the law, a mass movement had already transformed the legal terrain by putting its constitutional vision into practice. To paraphrase Thurgood Marshall, the attorney who argued Brown v. Board and went on to become the first Black justice on the Supreme Court, do what's right and force the law to catch up. The Constitution's command to tear down oppressive structures and create an egalitarian society in its stead must be more than just a nice idea. All of the country's residents are equal inheritors of the American democratic project, and our legal and political systems should treat us as such. The whole point of the Reconstruction Amendments was to build an equitable multiracial democracy and include the people who elites had forced out of the democratic project. These amendments tell us that the Constitution includes everyone, and so we need to interpret the Constitution in a way that makes inclusive democracy real, and the public has the power to do so. I know it doesn't always seem that way. The oppressive systems the country was built on continue to concentrate political and economic power in the hands of a wealthy white male minority. The government that is supposed to serve all of us continues to threaten the lives and liberties of marginalized people. It can be demoralizing, to say the least. Earlier today, I was thinking about the extent of what we're up against, and I found myself remembering that line from an old fisherman's poem to the effect of, "Oh God, thy sea is so great and my boat is so small." So you too may be wondering, who am I to fight all of this? How do I even begin? For starters, you don't do it alone. History is often condensed into stories about individuals, and there are certainly exceptional individuals, but it's when we bring those individuals together and combine our forces that we can really wield power. The bus boycott I just spoke about wasn't just Mrs. Rosa Parks or Dr. Martin Luther King, but Ms. Parks and the Women's Political Council and Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Improvement Association and the 40,000 people who stuck together, who carpooled, who offered to drive people who couldn't take the bus or were too far to walk, and they gained community and strength from each other. King once recounted a story about being bullied by an elder in the community. Mother Pollard was a woman in the church. She was in her 70s or so at the time, and she had been walking for weeks at this point in the boycott. And Dr. King spoke to her and said, "Mother Pollard, you could just take the bus. Like you're 72. Like think about your health. Like it's okay. Like you don't have to do this. You can walk." And she replied to him saying, "My feet is tired, but my soul is rested." Collective action can provide a great dual opportunity to disturb the system but soothe the spirit. And it might surprise you to learn that every civil rights hero who you admire was just a person who at some point or another had those same thoughts about the magnitude of the odds, yet it didn't stop them from fighting, and often it didn't stop them from winning. King had doubts towards the end of his life about what the Constitution has to offer. He reasoned that it was clearer when he was fighting for the right to vote, for instance, that the Constitution backed his demands. So he felt more confident about the possibility of eventually winning support from federal courts. But there were still many areas where Black people were suffering the effects of racism. And although he morally believed in a right to adequate housing and a right to adequate income, he wrote that the voice of the Constitution is not clear in those areas. We have left the realm of constitutional rights, and we are entering the area of human rights, he wrote. This is a rare instance where I'm actually inclined to break with King. It is observable as an empirical matter that the Constitution's meaning changes and has changed over time when it has been the subject of disagreement. The same things King believed the Constitution clearly required, many of his contemporaries believed it clearly did not. Consequently, he created the realm of constitutional rights of which he spoke. The constitutional order is regularly in a state of flux, and the scope and force of law depend on public assent. The question then is not necessarily, does the Constitution clearly do this, but can we make it clear that the Constitution does this? What do we think the best interpretation is? What interpretation is the public prepared to accept? Or, alternatively, what will the public refuse to accept? Guided by the revolutionary and egalitarian ideals embodied in the Reconstruction Amendments, inclusive constitutionalism urges the public to refuse to accept anything less than full equality and freedom for all. We have not yet achieved the multiracial democracy King dreamed of. This much is true. It is also true that there are significant obstacles in our path, but I do not believe those hurdles are insurmountable. Dr. King's legacy gives us proof of the power that people have. White supremacy tried to snuff the life out of democracy, but with mass protests and boycotts, marches and sit-ins, litigation, legislation, and more, he breathed life back into it. King also drew hope from the freedom fighters of yesteryear, who had little, yet accomplished much. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, he wrote, the opposition we face now will surely fail. This resolve will serve us well in the years to come. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. teaches us that a more just society, a better world is possible if we fight for it with commitment, with creativity, and with community. I look forward to fighting by your side. Thank you. Don't be shy.
Hello, thank you. My name's Gabriel. I appreciated your talk this evening. As you talk about Dr. King, such a uniting person that brought together a wide range of folks to create lasting change, I'm wondering if you could share any modern examples of people you look to in the current era who are uniting a wide range of people.
I'm going to mosey back over here where the microphone is. Thank you, Gabriel, for attendance and your question. That's a tough one. Like, King had a really sort of like unique way with words to sort of like captivate audiences in that way. I feel like one of the closest things I think of is like 2008 Barack Obama, who like was very much compelling, I think, to people and animated like broad swaths of people. But in terms of who was doing that sort of community and power building now, I'm not as certain, especially if we're talking about like, you know, cross racial lines. I think that, you know, there's perhaps like an opportunity to have something like that with like union organizers who will sort of like by default have like this group of people who have similarly like material conditions and issues, but could have any other like range of things going on in their lives. But I'm struggling to think of a king-like figure. I don't know if we have one just yet, or if we do, I don't know them yet.
Short as I am, I kind of have to move that down. I'm Melissa O'Rourke. Thank you so much for being here. I am an attorney. Having recently retired, I'm going back to doing more work in immigration law, volunteer work. My question is this. In this last campaign, I did an awful lot of door knocking, right up to through Election Day, getting out the vote. And as many of us know and have read or have seen with our boots on the ground, many people who proudly announced to me, we're all voting for Trump here. And I look at where they were living, the conditions they were living in, and think to myself, what do you think he cares about you? What do you think he's going to do for you? People voting against their own best interests. And this election will continue, of course, to be greatly analyzed, but we read things about in various places in the country or across the country or in certain states where we see people of color, marginalized people, who appear to have voted against their own best interests. And I'm not going to ask you why, but how do we respond to that going forward? Do you have any thoughts and advice on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Melissa, you said?
Yes.
Thank you, Melissa. And for going back to legal work, like Lord knows the immigration field can definitely need it. I think that's a really good question. One of the, I have a multi-part answer. So one of the things that comes to mind when we think about voting against people's best interests is that sometimes we just have to grapple with the fact that it is in their interests, that they just also have bad interests. Like I think it was Baldwin that had coined the phrase, you know, the psychological wage of whiteness when he was talking about like poor white Americans who would rather stay poor if they could still look down on a black person. So I think that's something to account for. And you know, I guess if we're sort of like expanding like beyond just white people, I think sometimes that can be the case as well, maybe in communities of color, if we're talking about talking about like a patriarchal sort of like mindset, like saying, you know, it's not women, or if it's like an anti-queer thing. So I think there are still ways of like separating people, and where folks like have this sort of interest that conflicts with their material reality, but is something they have a different kind of interest in. But I also think part of it is mis and disinformation. I think that I was just talking with folks earlier when I was at dinner this evening about a conversation I was reading where it was like an undocumented woman who was saying how she supports Trump and she's so glad her kids who are citizens are voting for Trump and stuff. And the interviewer was trying to like, did you hear what he said though about like mass deportations? And she was like, oh, but he wasn't talking about me. Like he was talking about like the bad people. Like he was talking about like this. And so sometimes people just honestly have no idea, like don't actually know what they're signing up for in a way. The policies has either been pitched to them in such a way that they think it's something different, or like they like misunderstood. So I think a lot of it is like information gap as well, and a gap in getting the information, and when they do get it, how that information is packaged as well. So I think it's a range of things. There's the idea of, you know, what, like the breadth of their interest, whether sometimes they are interested in oppression of various groups of people, if they fully comprehend like what the policy is as well. And I think sort of how we address that, I think you need to make it clear to people, again, like how it matters to their individual life. I think you need to like find the inroad of like the issue they care about and show them like how that thing's not being met. I was having a conversation once with a lovely bartender who indulged me as I'm here with a drink, like, what do you think would make you care about the Supreme Court? As a normal person who's like not like knee deep in this all the time. And she was sort of like, I don't know what to tell you, crazy lady. And I was like, what if I told you the Supreme Court is hearing a case next week that determines whether or not you get overtime pay? And she was like, I beg your pardon. So I think sometimes you need to like meet people where they are, and like find out what that entry point is, because like there could be something where you could connect with them. And yeah, you mentioned door knocking. Again, I think like a lot of people, it is a matter of talking to them, a matter of conversations, because people just believe in any old thing. So, so if you can get through to them and get in touch with them, that's a big step right there. And the next big thing, I think, is there's a big pool. It's not, so that the country is not 50-50 or like 51-49, even like Trump people or Harris people or what have you. Like there are the plurality who voted for Trump, and there's the slightly less number that voted for Harris, and there's the enormous amount of people who didn't vote. And there's a big amount of people who can't vote. So those two right there are these big untapped pools where, so instead of necessarily thinking about how do we pull this person away from voting against their interests, we might think of how do we get this person to come out and vote? Like why is it that they were staying home? Was it ideological? Was it an information thing? Because sometimes it is an information thing. When I was doing some phone banking and whatnot, I remember got this one guy. My fiance was horrified as he was hearing me have this call. Because the guy was like, oh, no, I haven't voted yet. I was thinking I might go tomorrow. And I was like, okay, so today's the last day. There is no choice. He's like, I can't go tomorrow. I'm like, you can't go tomorrow. The polls close at 6 in your neighborhood. So sometimes people just really don't know. So yeah, just finding out what the obstacle is so you can remove whatever that burden is. So yeah, a lot of that comes back to talking with people and find out what their unique problem is so we can address it.
Hi, I'm Martin, and I teach here, as many people know. And today in class, I decided I wanted to honor Dr. King by showing the last few minutes of the Memphis speech the evening before he died, because I was always been moved by, I've been to the mountaintop. That's a very emotional appeal, and how he ends that speech. I hadn't listened to it for a while, but as you probably know, he ends that speech really, or much of the last part of the speech is about the Constitution, where he says, somewhere I read about freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. So I think that really gelled with what so the point is, right to the very end of his life, although he didn't know it was the end of his life, he was speaking about the Constitution and about that difference between what it's meant to be and how it's carried out. Could you give us an example of what inclusive constitutionalism would look like in practice, for example, with the admissions cases? I assume that it would be an analytical framework where you'd ask something like, what is the greatest good to bring people into our society? Just give an example or two of how your inclusive constitutionalism might overturn or might reverse some recent decisions that have been made. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Martin. With respect to the affirmative action cases, I think there are a couple of different things that inclusive constitutionalism would take stock of. One is that sort of obviously race-conscious remedies are permissible. Even by an ostensibly originalist metric, they should find race-conscious remedies permissible. I would argue that, first of all, Amendments 13 through 15 were all race-conscious remedies. I would further argue that there was lots of legislation at that time, like the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, and some of the original civil rights acts were, again, explicitly race-conscious remedies. So I would think we have evidence right there that when we have this population that has historically been discriminated against and is still experiencing the results of that discrimination, of course the government can respond to that. In fact, the government has an obligation to respond to that. So I think that's the sort of most clear-cut way that it would sort of deal with the affirmative action cases. And that's a bit different from even pre-Students for Fair Admissions. That's a different kind of jurisprudence than we had. Because the reparative argument was rejected. I want to say it's maybe 30, 40 odd years ago. Yeah, the Supreme Court didn't want to hear that. They said it's like, it's not the schools or like the government's job to sort of try to address social inequality, or like unless they had like a really specific recent example that they could show they were trying to undo. And the sort of backdoor way they eventually came to actually maybe you can do some affirmative action was the benefits of diversity, which, again, sure, diversity is important, but that's not the only thing that matters. And it's almost like a little bit offensive to say, we can't remedy this harm, but like it'll also be good for these white kids to be in school with people of color. It's like, okay, we gotta think bigger than that. So I think that is one of the ways that inclusive constitutionalism would shift the focus a bit, so we can, really like think about the harm that is being done and what would be required to address that. So actually, and now I'm just thinking and going further. I'm thinking that that might be especially relevant with education, since I would think that education is such a necessary component to be an active, informed citizen, especially as we were just talking about lack of information that people sometimes have. And the idea of education as a right is something that the country has walked close to, but never actually crossed that line. That was, in fact, one of the great shortcomings of Brown v. Board of Education was that the court said, where the state is providing something, where it's like giving public education, it has to do so equally. And a lot of state and local governments said, if we're providing it, you say, and then just stopped having schools. And so like that was why there was an increase in private schools, private religious schools, but were also called like segregation academies, because it was like so those kids could go to school in a segregated environment, because the government just decided that if its choices were providing equal education or providing no education, it would do no education. Thank you very much. So I think that it would be good to like think about that as well in terms of like the affirmative action context of like the deprivation of schooling and like how much we need to make sure that folks have this opportunity.
Thank you for being here. My question is, do you think we'll ever reach a point where the Constitution fundamentally fails to protect the people, or even enshrines discrimination in such a way that we would need to cast it aside?
That's a great question. I have a sort of like yes and no answer, because I think I would certainly want to cast aside some parts of it. There are some parts that I think should be tossed and amended, but also like there are some great parts in there too that I would rather we not get rid of. Like I don't think I can't square the idea of like locking in oppression with something like the Eighth Amendment that forbids cruel and unusual punishment. I feel like that's sort of like objectively good. Like there's not something problematic there. But on the other hand, there are parts of the Constitution that are definitely holding the country back. I think that the Senate is one of those, for example. The Senate is created by the Constitution and is technically like one of like very few parts of the Constitution that you're not allowed to amend. Article 5 which is the part of the Constitution that spells out the amendment process. I'm pretty sure it has something that's like, oh, like this is how amendments work, except you're not allowed to touch the Senate, and you're not allowed to touch, there was a provision like super early where it was like, slavery is still legal until at least this time. And you can't touch that part either. It was like, if you want to reevaluate and consider abolishing slavery, come back in 20 years, maybe you can look at it then, but like for now it's alone. So I think like those could definitely go. So I think that's something that's holding us back. I think the Electoral College is like sort of a creature of the Constitution, because it's not actually, they don't really like technically like lay out like what the Electoral College is or like how it works or how it must work, but other parts of the Constitution talk about, the electors. And so there are ways to work around it, such as, there's this idea that's called like the National Popular Vote Compact, where it's like a group of states would just agree together that like if like a candidate has the amount of, would have the amount of like electoral votes, like but for, if they have won the popular vote and it's just like the math isn't mathin' because of electoral college stuff, that they would give their votes to that person. Like they would just say, electoral college is this now. And that's like a legislative workaround, right? Like it doesn't require a constitutional amendment, but it's still like messy and would be easier if you just didn't have to worry with that in the first place. So I feel like that's another area where the structure of the Constitution is holding us back. I think we might also be able to argue that maybe there are some things that like aren't in the Constitution that should be, that are like structurally holding us back as well. Like maybe if there was something in there about how the filibuster can be used, that like would prevent some of the like filibuster use and abuse that we've seen. Personally, I can't stand these weak sauce filibusters that Congress members do now, where they just say I'm filibustering and they don't even have to stand up on their feet. Like, no, I'm like, give me that Jimmy Stewart went to Washington, like standing up like all day long. I was reading this historical account. Again, Congress just doesn't get down like it used to, because in this, like, some Congress member had tried to like poison another one who was filibustering, because they're like, oh, he can't stand up there all day if he's got to go throw up. And I'm like, that's the only kind of real filibuster I respect, honestly. Like, I feel like I need it to be on that level. Otherwise, it's not a real filibuster. So yeah, all of this is a roundabout way of saying that yes, there are some parts of the Constitution that are not helpful and are maybe like actively harmful, and that I think we should depart from. But there are also some parts of it that I think are worth holding on to. I know some folks, and I understand why they would be like, get rid of the whole thing. Say like it's irredeemably tainted by the level of failures we've seen, by being the product of enslavers, to say like there's sort of like no hope for it. I get that, but I also think sort of what I was saying earlier, like they didn't live up to the things, but some of the things they said were still good, like freedom of speech, being able to not get arrested for criticizing the government. That was a good idea. So I would want to hang on to something like that. It's a race. It's Martin Luther King Day.
Hello, first of all, thank you so much for being here. My name is Sonnet. I am a senior at Luther College. I don't know if anyone else can relate to this, but I'm a very big consumer and producer of content on social media, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot going on with the media related to the election. I mean, TikTok only being shut down for 14 hours, and before even Donald Trump is in office, it comes back. Mm-hmm. A lot of stuff with like tech people being like involved in the government, like Elon Musk, and I don't know if you saw it earlier today, but he made a symbol that people are debating if it's like a Nazi thing or not, but I'll just leave it at that. As someone who consumes and produces content on social media, what advice do you have for us to be like careful and sensitive and considerate consumers and producers of media in order to like not make things politically worse than they already are, or something like that.
Thank you. Sonia, you said?
Sonnet, like the poem.
Oh, that's lovely. Sonnet. That's a really interesting question. How to be a responsible social media user? People have been trying to figure that one out for a while. Let me think. So I think part of it, I guess I'm thinking less about the user and more about like the platform, like what kind of things are permitted on the platform. Like I know that Meta, it will always be Facebook to me, sort of like just revised their standards in this like horrible way, being like we've like reevaluated like our hate speech rules, and I was like, it went from hate speech rules as in like how to govern conduct to hate speech rules. Like, we love us some hate speech. And like how they were just green lighting all sorts of horribleness. And so I think that's like a blatantly like irresponsible social media use right there, to like allow the platform to be used and abused in that way. And Facebook in particular, I think, should know better because I think there was a lot of that some years ago in Myanmar, where folks think that the way Facebook was used there like helped fan the flames of the genocide that then happened there. So yeah, real bad stuff there, I think. But that's again on the sort of structural end. From a user standpoint, let me think. I go back and forth sometimes on, well, I guess it's a matter of, trying to use our best judgment on engaging with people. I think like sometimes, because I am also a aggressive social media user, and I think I sometimes will try to make an assessment. Like if someone says some nonsense, I think like I might take a quick look at their individual post or maybe some of their other posts and be like, do I think this is just a bad actor who I should just block now and just like, not platform this person? Or do I think this is a person who could potentially be reasoned with? And do I have the time/patience to do that reasoning right now? And so sometimes I give it a shot, and I have been like pleasantly surprised on occasions when someone listens, or even if someone did not listen, I have been further pleasantly surprised by like someone else's response, like reaching out to me and being like, hey, I had this kind of issue, but I like wasn't sure, I couldn't put it into words, but like now I feel like I know what it was, and so I feel like can still be value there. But other times it's just, like a bot or just a virulent racist or some transphobe, and it's like, it is not at all worth talking to this person. Just block, deny them oxygen, do not let their horribleness get out there. So I guess those are, on the user level, that's the kind of thing I think about. Like, am I risking giving a greater platform to someone who we could just pretend doesn't exist?
Hello, my name is Aaron, and as we all know, we live in an increasingly volatile world, both politically and like socially. It's just like a very like revolutionary time, I guess. That's how I would like to describe it. But being like an individual and just looking at all of this stuff happening on the internet that is increasingly broadcasted to us in like 4K, like you can like see everything around the world. You almost feel like helpless in a way. What would you say to people who feel like they have no power, or who want to do the right thing but just don't know where to start? That's
an excellent question, Aaron. Yeah, I think I've heard that a lot from folks being like, you know, I don't know what it is I can do or if there is anything I can do. And I think really that there's always something we can do and that everyone has something they can contribute. And, you know, like if you have money, give money. If you have time, give time and like volunteer with something. If you have some sort of like skill, like maybe you're really good at organizing something. It'll be like helpful for like an advocacy group that just like needs to get some stuff together. And like I know some folks who are like, I personally can't attend this protest for like X, Y, and Z reasons, but it's, you know, like super hot outside. So like for like protests, like if you need a place to like come hydrate, like my apartment is here. Like everyone has like some sort of way that they can be helpful, or like if you're like, oh, if you need to write a phone number on your arm, if you're like going to a protest just in case you get arrested and like need to be able to call somebody, like use my number. If you want to be a protest like a legal observer, can get involved with the like national, what is it called? National Lawyers Guild. There are all sorts of things, especially at the local level. Like I think if you like look around and see sort of like what you think your community needs, or like just what issue it is that matters to you, there's probably someone in your area working on it, and you can go help them or like see what they need. And like you can contribute to that. Also, just thinking about sort of like local levels, I know a big thing I've been hearing more about recently is like folks running for like school board elections or library boards, which are like things that matter and are like hyper local and like don't get a lot of attention. And so like could be like an easy in to be able to make a big difference, especially, you know, if you're like looking around at some of the states where they're just like banning books. Yeah, it's like could be like valuable to have. Oh, here's one of them. Oh, God. Sorry, y'all. Could be like good to have, you know, a person in like a library board position or a school board position to push back against that. I think there are also helpful. There are some sort of like lists online that I've like come across before. Like sometimes like activists like will circulate things in these sort of like crisis moments. Like I know when Dobbs came down and some folks were like, what can I do? Or like, I will help someone get an illegal abortion. And like people who've been doing abortion advocacy forever were like, okay, well, first of all, don't say that out loud. That's how you get arrested. So that's step one. And like step two, like there are people already doing this work. And so like these like abortion funds, like people who help like get gas money to people who need to get out of state, like they could use that help, or people who like need a ride, like they could use that help. So there are lots of things we can do that might not strike us as big things, but will help someone. And I think the sort of like biggest categories of things are like, you know, like money, time, or like a skill or some sort of like other resource. So like look to see like what thing it is that you have and what sort of gap you can fill. And honestly, sometimes just like straight up like Googling like what can I do about X topic, whatever it is that's bothering you. Like some activist has probably thought of something and like prepared a list being like, if you are new to X cause, it will be helpful to do like Y and Z. Those things are out there. Also, for feeling hopeless, I would recommend like, what is it? There's like I think it's called like truthout.org. They have some really good sort of like progressive community writing, including things about, you know, how do we care for ourselves and each other in like times like these. So like finding like those kinds of materials, I think could be really restorative as well. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Dr. Madiba, for your insightful lecture. So my question is, claiming Dr. King was nothing sort of a radical revolutionary is a gross misrepresentation of his legacy. But since the mid-1980s, when Ronald Reagan officially made MLK Day a holiday, there has been this sanitization of the radicalness of Dr. King. You know, in the 1950s and 60s, his approval ratings among white people was below 25%, but now it's over 95%. And racist right-wing groups whose entire existence and whose entire purpose is to fight against diversity, equity, and inclusion that Dr. King championed, even dared to, you know, invoke parts of his legacy, particularly the part of his I Have the Dream speech where he said he hopes for a time in America where his kids will not be judged for the color of their skin, but the content of their character. So my question is, how do we, in this day and age, dispense with this sanitized version of Dr. King and reinvoke that radical spirit that Dr. King stood for?
I love that. That is an excellent closing question. Yeah, it is so real and so frustrating seeing these people who have no business having Dr. Kim's name in their mouths, who are doing like everything against what he fought for and yet are sort of like claiming him. And so I think a fun way I've seen that addressed sometimes is seeing people just be like, read another speech. Like, like, this is not the only thing this man said. Like, he has said a lot, like, here's some information for you. Or just, like, pulling out other, like, meaningful quotes, so basically, like, confronting them with the other parts. Just being like, oh, you like this thing that Martin Luther King said? Like, well, what about this part? And also, just sort of, I guess, getting them to think more critically about the part they are quoting at you, saying, like, you know, he was saying that he wants to get to that point. Like, he was not saying that we are at that point or that we can just stop thinking about it and it will take us to that point. He was saying that we need to like take steps to like bring about like racially just society so that we don't have to think about this. But just deciding not to think about it is obviously not how it works. So I think, like pointing that out to people, like making them read the letter from Birmingham jail because the white moderate part hits hard for some folks. And which one was this in? I think, so something that I have found sort of like similarly a bit irritating, I think, is when people cling to the arc of history is long, but bends towards justice. I have found that sometimes people say that and assume that the arc just bends itself, and like in that same kind of way of like, it said judge by the content of the character, so like don't think about this, and it's like that's not what it meant. And I found that sometimes people just sort of act like, yeah, it'll get there, as if that excuses us of responsibility. Or as if that means that like we don't have acts to take if we're not obligated to push that arc along. And in fact, like King has also spoken about time and saying that like time can be a bad thing if it's like stagnation in that time. And he's like, I fear that, the people on the other side have been using their time really well. Like they've been really like efficient with their time. So I think that, trying to point out the other parts of King's quotes, reminding them of the other parts of his legacy as well, including that, this whole love fest for King is new. Like King was like not, people were not a fan of him in that day. Thought he was, too disruptive. Thought he was wanted too much too fast. Hated when he started even speaking, outside of just U.S. specific issues, or talking about the Vietnam War and talking about capitalism. They couldn't stand it. And so just trying to say, like King is not the caricature you are making him out to be. And so you should, do some reading and do some thinking, and and come back to me. And we can, do our best to live out the actual sort of like principles we see in his writing. And we can claim ourselves as like the other parts of King's legacy, like invoke the part that we are addressing or that we are trying to deal with, rather than just, letting them trot around with their sanitized version.
Let's give Dr. Madiba Dennie another round of applause. So I had this scripted long speech, closing remarks, but something just came over me. I don't know how long Lawrence Williams had or the college has been doing MLK programming and things like that regarding on the MLK lecture, but I know for me, this is my third one, and it always seemed like it is one of the coldest days of the year. But I think this coldness reminds us of the bitterness and the strength it takes to endure some of the things Dr. King went through, and to remind us that work still needs to be done, and there are better days ahead, but it challenges us to do what we need to do. And so we've created Dream Week here at the college to really speak to making Dr. King's dream actionable and not just aspirational. And so this week, we kicked off today with the lovely speech by Madiba about multiracial democracy. But we have a host of events taking place throughout the week. Tomorrow, we have a conversation on racial healing with some of our partners from the Northeast Iowa Peace and Justice Center and the Human Rights Commission of the Corps. And then on Wednesday, we have a service of prayer and remembrance led by our own Pastor Mike Wilker of First Lutheran Church here in Decorah, as well as Dr. Guy Nave, a professor of religion. On Thursday, we have community engagement with Decorah Public Schools, read-ins with our elementary school students at 9 and also at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. If you're interested in signing up for that, you can see Michelle Boyke, Sister Dean for SICE Director. She's here. Also, that evening, we'll be showing Selma, speaking to the migrant bus boycott that she just spoke about in regards to different things of that nature, regarding suffrage and things of that nature. And then also, we're going to close out the week with a brown bag discussion on the intersection of faith and justice, because I think sometimes we forget that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was a man of faith, and it's important to bring those ties back to everything that took place. So again, just want to thank everybody for coming out this evening and really celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. King, and know that the work is not done. The work shall continue, and we must really be committed to make sure our Lutheran values of faith and we are being active and not passive. And that also Dr. King calls us to build a society rooted in radical inclusion, equity, and justice. So I thank you for coming out tonight. Again, let's give a round of applause to Dr. Madiba Dennie, Identity Studies, the Williams Endowment Fund, our colleagues here at the college, and also, again, thank you for coming out. God bless. Have a great night.